You can buy attention, Claire said softly, tightening her grip on the coffee tray. But the moment you try to buy respect, people notice. The laughter around the rooftop lounge faded almost instantly. Ethan Carter leaned back in his leather chair, one arm resting casually beside a half-finished glass of bourbon that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Manhattan shimmered behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, all gold lights and midnight reflections, the city glowing like it belonged to him alone. Maybe in some ways, it did. At 37, Ethan owned a private aviation company, a luxury media group, and enough real estate across the East Coast to make financial magazines obsessed with his face. People moved differently around him. Faster, politer, hungrier. But Claire Whitmore didn't. She stood there in her black waitress uniform, a simple silver necklace resting against her collarbone, her blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck, not intimidated in the slightest. The billionaire studied her carefully for the first time all evening. Most women smiled harder when they recognized him. Most people did. Claire looked exhausted instead. "That's a dangerous thing to say to a man paying your paycheck tonight," joked one of Ethan's friends from across the table. A few nervous laughs followed. Claire smiled politely. "Good thing my paycheck comes from the restaurant, not his ego." Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. There it was again. Not flirtation. Not fear. Just honesty delivered so calmly it became impossible to fight. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass walls of the rooftop terrace. The jazz piano drifting through the speakers gave the room the feeling of a movie nobody wanted to leave. Ethan should have gone home an hour ago. He had an early flight to Aspen in the morning, 3 board meetings next week, and a private dinner with investors in Los Angeles after that. Instead, he found himself watching a waitress carry sparkling water across a crowded room like she somehow existed outside the gravity of everyone else. "You always judge people this fast?" Ethan finally asked. Claire set another drink onto the table with quiet precision. "Only the ones trying too hard not to be judged." One of the men nearly choked on his whiskey. Ethan almost smiled. "Almost. Do you know who he is?" Another woman at the table asked, sounding genuinely confused by Claire's composure. Claire glanced toward Ethan for barely a second. A tired man wearing an expensive watch. Silence. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass shattered. Nobody at the table moved. Ethan slowly looked down at the Swiss watch wrapped around his wrist. Platinum. Limited edition. $600,000. Yet somehow her sentence made it feel embarrassingly small. Claire reached for the empty plates. "Anything else tonight?" Ethan should have let her walk away. Instead, something unfamiliar pulled at him. Curiosity. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Dinner with me tomorrow night." Claire stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then she looked him directly in the eyes. Calm. Unshaken. "No." The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan blinked once, genuinely caught off guard. Across the table, his friends exchanged stunned looks like they had just witnessed a magic trick fail in real time. "You don't even know where I was planning to take you," Ethan said. "That's kind of the problem." Her voice remained soft, almost sympathetic. Men who lead with luxury usually expect women to follow. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "And if I said I'm different?" Claire picked up the final empty glass from the table. "Rich men always say that before the helicopter shows up." Then she walked away beneath the golden lights of the rooftop restaurant while the billionaire sat completely still, staring after the only woman in years who seemed entirely unimpressed by his world. Claire Whitmore had learned a long time ago that wealthy men hated silence almost as much as rejection. The elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft metallic hum as she descended from the rooftop lounge toward the employee level below. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished steel walls. Blonde hair slightly messy from the rain outside. Black uniform wrinkled from 10 straight hours on her feet. Tired blue eyes that looked older tonight than 28. Should allow. Around her neck, the tiny silver piano charm her father gave her years ago caught the dim elevator light for only a second before disappearing again. "You are insane," her coworker Melissa whispered the moment Claire stepped into the service hallway. "Do you even know how rich that man is?" Claire untied her apron slowly. "Probably richer than he is happy." Melissa laughed nervously, glancing toward the dining room entrance like Ethan Carter himself might suddenly appear. "No, seriously. That was Ethan Carter. Carter Aviation. Carter Media. Private islands. Political donations. The guy owns like 3 jets. Claire folded the apron neatly over her arm. Good for him. Good for him. Melissa nearly choked. Claire, women literally throw themselves at men like that. Claire grabbed her coat from the locker room bench. Dark wool. Slightly worn sleeves. Still carrying the faint scent of winter rain from last week. That sounds exhausting for everyone involved. Melissa stared at her in disbelief. You did not even hesitate. Claire paused for a moment before slipping one arm into her coat. That is because men like him expect hesitation. The hallway fell quiet except for the distant sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen upstairs. Somewhere above them, jazz music still floated through the restaurant speakers while Manhattan continued glowing beneath the storm clouds. Claire checked the time on her phone. 12:43 a.m. She still had another subway ride downtown and 6 hours before her morning piano lesson with a 9-year-old boy in Queens who struggled with confidence more than music. Life did not slow down just because billionaires appeared unexpectedly. As she pushed open the back exit door, cold rain immediately swept across the alleyway beside the building. Wind curled around the skyscrapers hard enough to shake the traffic lights overhead. Claire pulled her coat tighter and stepped carefully onto the wet sidewalk. Then she heard it, the low rhythmic chopping sound somewhere above the city. She stopped walking. A helicopter descended slowly between the surrounding towers, its lights cutting through the rain like something unreal. People on the sidewalk turned instinctively toward the sky. Taxi drivers leaned halfway out their windows. Even the doorman from the neighboring hotel froze beneath his umbrella. Claire watched the aircraft move toward the rooftop landing platform across the street. Black, sleek, expensive enough to look untouchable. The wind intensified as it lowered. Her hair whipped across her face. Water splashed against the curb beside her boots. Then another sound followed. Sir, the jet is fueled and ready for departure. Claire turned. One of Ethan Carter's security men stood beside a line of black SUVs parked outside the restaurant entrance. Rain rolled off the man's earpiece as he held open the rear passenger door. Ethan emerged moments later, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal overcoat with the same calm expression he wore upstairs. But now the illusion was gone. Upstairs he had looked wealthy. Down here he looked powerful. Drivers straightened when he passed. Security moved before he spoke. The city itself seemed to reorganize around him. Ethan glanced toward the helicopter first. Then his eyes found Claire standing alone beneath the streetlight. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Rain shimmered between them in silver streaks. Claire finally understood what Melissa meant. This was not ordinary money. This was the kind of wealth that built airports, changed elections, and erased waiting lines. Ethan crossed the sidewalk toward her slowly, hands in his coat pockets. Still think I am just a tired man with an expensive watch? Claire looked past him toward the helicopter blades spinning overhead. No, she admitted quietly. Now I think you are a tired man with an expensive helicopter too. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. A real laugh this time. Short, honest, unpracticed. It surprised both of them. Claire noticed it immediately. Billionaires in magazines never looked genuinely amused. They looked managed. Ethan studied her face carefully beneath the rain. Most people react differently after seeing all this. Claire glanced at the black SUVs, the waiting pilot, the security detail standing silently nearby. That sounds lonely. Something shifted in Ethan's expression then. Small, almost invisible, but real. The helicopter lights reflected briefly across his eyes before disappearing into the storm. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain softened slightly around the edges of the street, while the helicopter continued humming above the rooftop across the avenue. Claire noticed how different Ethan looked outside the restaurant lights. Less polished somehow. The expensive coat was still there. The tailored posture. The quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. But exhaustion lived underneath all of it now, clearer than before. You should probably get going, Claire said gently. People with helicopters usually have somewhere important to be. Ethan looked toward the aircraft waiting above them. That is the problem. Claire tilted her head slightly. The helicopter? The somewhere important part. She studied him carefully, unsure if he was joking. His expression never changed. Behind them, a black SUV idled beside the curb while rainwater streamed along the pavement in silver lines. One of the security men glanced discreetly at his watch before looking away again. Ethan ignored him completely. Do you know what my assistant scheduled for me tomorrow? he asked suddenly. Claire slipped her hands into her coat pockets for warmth. Probably something expensive. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Breakfast meeting in Aspen. Investor lunch in Denver. Private dinner in Los Angeles. Then back to Manhattan before midnight. That sounds miserable. Ethan laughed quietly again. Most people call it success. Claire looked past him toward the endless rows of glowing windows climbing into the dark Manhattan sky. Thousands of people still awake. Thousands still chasing something. Sometimes those are not the same thing. The wind shifted suddenly, colder this time. Claire pulled her coat tighter around herself as another burst of rain swept down the block. Ethan noticed immediately. Where are you headed? Queens. He frowned slightly. At almost 1 in the morning? The subway still exists for poor people. Claire. She looked up at him. That joke stopped being funny after. The second billionaire tonight. Ethan shook his head once before opening the rear SUV door. At least let my driver take you home. Claire did not move. No, why? Because I do not want to owe you anything. Ethan stared at her carefully. A ride home during a thunderstorm is not a business transaction. Maybe not for you. The sentence landed softly between them. Honest. Uncomfortable. Ethan closed the SUV door slowly without taking his eyes off her. Somewhere nearby, a taxi splashed through standing water while neon reflections rippled across the street like broken paint. Claire watched him carefully now. Men like Ethan Carter were usually impossible to read. Years of negotiations and boardrooms taught them how to hide reactions before they appeared. But she noticed the brief tightening in his jaw. The almost invisible pause before speaking. You really think that badly of rich people? He asked quietly. Claire considered the question longer than expected. No, she admitted. I think rich people stop hearing honest answers after a while. Ethan looked away toward the city for the first time since approaching her. Traffic lights flickered red across the wet avenue. Steam rose from a subway vent nearby, curling through the rain like smoke. You know what the strange part is? He said eventually. You are probably right. Claire blinked slightly. She had not expected agreement. Ethan shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets. People tell me what they think I want to hear all day long. Employees, investors, reporters, sometimes even friends. He glanced back at her with a tired half-smile. You were the first person tonight who talked to me like I was annoying. You were annoying. Fair. Another silence followed. But this one felt different. Less defensive. Less sharp around the edges. Claire checked the subway schedule on her phone. Delays. Again. She sighed quietly under her breath. Ethan noticed that too. Train. 40-minute delay. And you still will not accept a ride? Claire hesitated this time. Only for a second. Ethan caught it immediately. There it is, he said softly. Progress. Do not get excited. Too late. She almost smiled. Almost. A gust of wind pushed rain sideways beneath the awning, forcing them both a step closer to the building entrance. Claire could smell cedarwood cologne mixed faintly with rainwater and cold night air. Expensive. Subtle. Nothing about Ethan Carter screamed for attention the way she expected. That bothered her more than if it had. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Claire nodded cautiously. Why waitress jobs and subway delays if you clearly could do something else? Her eyes lowered briefly toward the silver piano charm resting against her neck. Ethan noticed the movement immediately. Long story, she said quietly. I have time. Claire looked toward the helicopter lights spinning above the rooftop across the street. Then back at the billionaire standing beside her in the rain like he suddenly did not want to leave. That makes one of us. The rain finally began to slow, turning Manhattan into a blur of silver reflections and glowing traffic lights. Claire stood beneath the awning beside Ethan Carter, listening to the distant sound of the helicopter above them while cold wind swept through the avenue. Somewhere across the street, a couple laughed beneath a shared umbrella. A taxi horn echoed through the wet night. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Yet standing beside one of the richest men in the country made everything feel strangely unreal. Ethan glanced again toward the silver piano charm resting near Claire's collarbone. You play? Claire touched the necklace instinctively, almost protective. I used to. Used to. She hesitated before answering. Juilliard prep program when I was younger. Ethan blinked once. Genuine surprise crossed his face. You went to Juilliard? For a while. That is not exactly a small detail to casually hide between serving cocktails. Claire gave a faint shrug. People hear Juilliard, and suddenly start asking what went wrong. Ethan studied her carefully. What did go wrong? For the first time since meeting him, Claire looked away completely, up toward the dark windows of the neighboring buildings, toward anything except his eyes. My father got sick. Her voice remained calm, but softer now. Cancer. Ethan's expression shifted immediately. I am sorry. So was he. She smiled faintly at the memory. He used to repair upright pianos in Brooklyn. Tiny little shop that smelled like coffee and would polish all the time. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. He thought every broken piano deserved another chance. Ethan listened quietly. No interruptions. No clever comments. Claire noticed that. When he got diagnosed, everything changed fast, she continued. Medical bills. Rent. My mother stopped working to take care of him. I started taking extra shifts anywhere I could. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the awning beside them. Ethan watched her carefully as she spoke. So you left school? Claire nodded once. 3 months before my final performance evaluation. Did you ever go back? A tiny laugh escaped her. Not bitter. Just tired. Life does not really pause politely while you chase artistic dreams. Ethan looked down briefly at the sidewalk between them. No, he admitted quietly. It does not. For a moment, Claire forgot who she was talking to. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the man with helicopters waiting on rooftops. Just someone standing beside her in the rain, listening like the answer actually mattered. Ethan shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets against the cold. You know what is strange? Claire looked at him cautiously. Most people spend 10 minutes talking to me and immediately bring up money. His eyes lifted toward her again. You have spent almost half an hour talking about your father's piano shop. Claire gave him a small look. That is because the piano shop sounds more important. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. You really do not care who I am, do you? I care who people are when nobody is watching. The sentence hit harder than she intended. Ethan went still for a second. Somewhere nearby, a black sedan rolled slowly through standing water while steam curled upward from a subway grate. The city never stopped moving. But something about this conversation felt strangely still. And what do you think you see? He asked quietly. Claire studied him carefully before answering. Honestly, please. I think you are exhausted. Ethan looked almost amused by that. That obvious? No. She glanced briefly toward the waiting helicopter above the rooftop. The obvious part is the money. The exhaustion is quieter. Ethan looked away again toward the skyline. My father used to say rest was for people without ambition. And was he happy? Ethan smiled faintly. Not even a little. Claire nodded slowly like that answered everything. Another silence settled between them, softer this time. Easier. Ethan checked his watch automatically before stopping himself halfway through the movement. Claire noticed. You do that a lot. What? Check the time. Ethan lowered his wrist. Occupational hazard. Or maybe you are always trying to outrun something. His eyes returned to hers instantly. Sharp this time. Searching. Claire immediately realized she had gotten too close to something real. She looked away first. Sorry, she said quietly. That was probably too personal. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds before speaking. No, he admitted softly. That was probably accurate. Above them, the helicopter lights continued spinning through the rain while neither of them moved toward leaving. The rain finally eased into a thin mist drifting through the city lights like smoke. Claire glanced once more at the subway delays on her phone before slipping it back into her coat pocket. 48 minutes now. Of course. Manhattan always seemed determined to humble people after midnight. Ethan noticed the frustration in her expression immediately. There is a diner 2 blocks from here that stays open all night, he said carefully. No helicopters. No investors. Just coffee. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. Are you trying to trick me into spending time with you? At this point, I am trying to stop you from freezing to death while waiting underground. She looked toward the street corner where cold wind continued pushing rainwater across the sidewalks. Then back at the billionaire standing beside her. You really do not take rejection very well. Ethan placed one hand over his chest dramatically. Claire, you wounded me deeply. She almost laughed again. Almost. That was becoming dangerous. 5 minutes later, they were walking side by side beneath the same black umbrella down a quieter street, glowing with neon reflections. Ethan carried the umbrella slightly higher, so it covered her more than him. Claire noticed, but said nothing. The city felt different this late at night. Softer somehow. Fewer horns. Fewer rushing footsteps. Steam drifted from subway grates, while tiny corner delis still glowed beneath fluorescent lights. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter walked through Manhattan without 3 assistants speaking into phones beside him. No meetings. No cameras. Just rain and a waitress who kept accidentally telling him the truth. "Do your security people always follow this far behind?" Claire asked quietly after noticing the black SUV slowly trailing half a block away. Ethan glanced behind them. "Usually closer." "That is terrifying. That is corporate liability." Claire shook her head softly. "You really live like that?" "Usually with more paperwork." The diner sat on a quiet corner beneath a flickering red sign that simply read "Open 24 hours." Inside, warm yellow lights spilled across checkerboard floors and worn leather booths. A tired college student slept over textbooks in the corner, while an older man in a Yankees cap quietly stirred cream into his coffee near the window. Nobody looked up when Ethan entered. Claire noticed the subtle shift in his posture immediately. His shoulders relaxed. Just slightly. A waitress in her 60s approached holding 2 menus. "Sit wherever you want, sweetheart." Ethan blinked once. Claire caught it instantly. "What?" she asked as they slid into a booth beside the fogged-up front window. Ethan looked strangely amused. "Nobody has called me sweetheart in years. You should come to Queens more often." The older waitress returned with coffee before either of them ordered. "Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, honey." Claire thanked her warmly, while Ethan quietly watched the interaction. "You know her?" he asked. "No. Then why are you smiling like that?" Claire wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug. "Because she looks tired." Ethan stared at her for a second. "You notice that? About people a lot." "Somebody should." The diner lights reflected softly in the window beside them, while rain continued sliding down the glass outside. Ethan loosened his coat slightly, looking more human now than billionaire. Less guarded. Claire realized she had never once seen him check his phone since they left the restaurant. That alone felt impossible. "So," Ethan said after a moment, "what would have happened if your father had never gotten sick?" Claire looked down into her coffee. "I probably would have become a concert pianist. Probably. Or failed spectacularly in front of very judgmental people." Ethan smiled faintly. "You do not seem like someone afraid of judgment." "I am not afraid of it." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "I just learned early that talent and survival are not always on the same team." Ethan leaned back against the booth, quietly absorbing that sentence. Outside, headlights slid across the rain-streaked windows in blurred gold lines. "My father hated music," he admitted suddenly. Claire looked up. "Really?" Ethan nodded once. "Thought it distracted people from work." "And your mother?" A strange silence followed that question. Ethan looked toward the diner window for several seconds before answering. "She played piano." Claire went still. Ethan gave a faint smile without humor. "Every Sunday morning. Same old Steinway in our Connecticut house." His eyes drifted somewhere far away now. "I used to sit on the stairs pretending I was not listening." Claire watched him carefully. This was the first time tonight his voice sounded younger somehow. Less controlled. "What happened?" she asked softly. Ethan looked back at her slowly. "She died when I was 16. The noise of the diner seemed to fade around them for a second. Claire's expression softened immediately. Not pity. Something quieter. Understanding. Ethan noticed that too. "After that," he continued, "my father filled every room in our house with business conversations because silence reminded him of her." Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the piano charm around her neck. "And now you fill every hour with meetings for the same reason." Ethan stared at her, completely speechless for the second time that night. Claire lowered her gaze slowly toward the coffee between her hands while Ethan remained completely still across from her in the diner booth. Outside, rain continued sliding down the fogged glass in thin silver streams, blurring the city lights into soft colors that barely looked real anymore. The old waitress behind the counter quietly refilled sugar containers while an old Frank Sinatra song drifted low through hidden speakers somewhere near the kitchen. For the first time all night, Ethan Carter looked like a man who had forgotten how to defend himself. Claire noticed it immediately. "I am sorry," she said softly. Ethan gave a faint shrug, but it carried no confidence behind it now. Most people are uncomfortable when conversations stop being superficial. Maybe because superficial things are easier to control. His eyes lifted toward hers again. Tired gray eyes. Quiet now instead of sharp. "You always do that." "Do what?" Take one sentence and somehow turn it into a therapy session. Claire smiled faintly into her coffee. Occupational hazard. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her with growing curiosity. Waitress. Piano teacher. Secret therapist. Terribly underpaid in all categories. A quiet laugh escaped him again. Claire noticed something strange every time he laughed naturally. He looked younger. Not physically, just lighter somehow. Less like the version of himself the world expected. The older waitress returned carrying 2 plates of grilled cheese sandwiches and a basket of fries neither of them remembered ordering. Kitchen closes in 5 minutes, sweethearts. Eat something. Ethan opened his mouth to explain they had not ordered yet, but Claire immediately smiled. Thank you. The woman winked before walking away. Ethan watched her disappear toward the kitchen. Does everyone in New York feed strangers like this? Only the good ones. Claire slid one of the plates toward him. You should eat. Ethan looked almost amused. You realize nobody tells me what to do anymore. That sounds unhealthy. He picked up half the sandwich anyway. You are strangely bossy for someone who rejected me an hour ago. Claire took a small bite before answering. You are strangely obedient for someone with a helicopter. Ethan nearly choked laughing this time. The sound turned a few heads across the diner. Claire blinked slightly in surprise. She realized she had probably just witnessed something very rare. A billionaire genuinely enjoying himself without cameras nearby. Ethan wiped one hand across his mouth, still smiling faintly. Do you know how long it has been since I sat in a place like this? A diner. Anywhere nobody wanted something from me. Claire looked down at the fries between them. That sounds sad. Ethan's smile faded slowly. It is. Silence settled again, softer than before. Comfortable now. Claire noticed Ethan watching the rain through the window while absently turning the coffee mug between his hands. Can I ask you something? She said carefully. Depends how emotionally devastating it is. Why did you really invite me to dinner earlier? Ethan looked back at her immediately. The humor disappeared from his face. Honest now. Because you looked at me like none of this mattered. Claire frowned slightly. And that impressed you? No, he paused briefly. It scared me. She blinked. Ethan looked toward the diner window again before continuing. Most people see the money first. The cars. The companies. The security. They adjust themselves around it. His fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. You did not. Claire stayed quiet. Ethan's voice lowered almost unconsciously. I realized after you walked away upstairs that I could not remember the last time somebody spoke to me without calculating something first. The rain tapped softly against the glass beside them while Claire absorbed his words carefully. She had spent years assuming men like Ethan Carter lived easy lives protected by wealth from everything painful or ordinary. Yet sitting across from him now felt unexpectedly human. Lonely in ways money clearly could not solve. You know what I think? She asked gently. Ethan looked up. I think people stopped treating you like a person a long time ago. Something in his expression shifted instantly. Quiet. Almost painful. Claire regretted saying it the second the words left her mouth. But Ethan just nodded once. Slowly. Probably around the same time I stopped acting like one. Neither of them spoke after that. Outside, a bus rolled through the wet avenue throwing reflections across the diner walls like moving gold. Ethan glanced at his watch again before stopping himself halfway through the motion. Claire noticed. There it is again. Ethan sighed quietly. Habit. Or fear. He looked at her carefully. Fear of what? Claire hesitated only briefly. Stillness. Ethan leaned back against the booth, staring at her like she had just unlocked something he spent years hiding even from himself. Then his phone buzzed loudly against the table for the first time all night. The screen lit up instantly with 6 missed calls and a message from his assistant marked urgent. Ethan stared at it without touching the phone. Claire watched him carefully. You should probably answer that. He looked at the screen for another long second before flipping the phone face down onto the table. No, he said quietly. I really should not. Claire stared at the phone lying face down between them, while the faint vibration continued against the diner table for several more seconds before finally stopping. Ethan leaned back against the booth quietly, his untouched coffee cooling beside him. Outside, the rain had almost completely disappeared now, leaving only wet pavement and shimmering reflections beneath the Manhattan streetlights. That looked important, Claire said carefully. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Everything in my life is marked urgent. That cannot possibly be healthy. It is very profitable, though. Claire shook her head faintly, but this time there was no sharpness in it, just disbelief. The old waitress walked past carrying fresh coffee for another customer and smiled softly at Ethan as she refilled his cup without asking. "You look less stressed now, sweetheart." Ethan blinked once in surprise. "That obvious?" "Honey, men only stop checking their phones when they finally breathe." Then she disappeared toward the kitchen again before he could answer. Claire watched Ethan carefully after that. The billionaire stared down into his coffee with an expression she could not fully read. Thoughtful, quiet, almost unsettled. "You know," Claire said softly, "normal people usually pay therapists for this level of emotional damage." Ethan smiled faintly without looking up. "I'm starting to realize that. And I still charge less than Aspen." That finally pulled another real laugh from him. Claire noticed again how rare genuine laughter seemed to be in his world, like something unused for too long. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw before glancing toward the diner window. "Do you ever think about going back?" Claire followed his gaze toward the city outside. "To Juilliard?" He nodded once. She stayed quiet for several seconds. "Every day." Ethan looked back at her immediately. Claire traced one finger absently along the coffee mug in her hands. "Sometimes when I teach piano lessons, one of my students will play something beautifully by accident." A small smile touched her lips. "And for maybe 3 seconds, I remember exactly who I used to be before life got loud." Ethan listened without interrupting. Claire noticed that too. Most people waited impatiently for their turn to speak. Ethan did not. "Why do not you audition again?" he asked quietly. Claire laughed softly under her breath. "Because the world is full of 20-year-old prodigies who practice 10 hours a day. And I waitress 35 hours a week and teach beginner piano lessons to children who mostly want snacks." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Claire." She looked up. "You talk about music the way people talk about someone they still love." The sentence landed gently between them. Claire looked away first this time, toward the rain-streaked diner window, toward the passing headlights outside. Anywhere except him. Ethan noticed the tiny change in her breathing, the way her fingers tightened around the mug. "That obvious?" she asked quietly. "Only to somebody who understands pretending work matters more than grief." Silence. Deep this time. The kind that settles into a room instead of passing through it. Claire studied him carefully across the table. Billionaire. Private. Jets. Security teams. Yet somehow the saddest thing about Ethan Carter was how easily he recognized loneliness in other people. His phone buzzed again. Longer this time. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, like the sound physically exhausted him. Claire finally pushed the phone gently across the table toward him. "You should answer." Ethan stared at the screen lighting up beneath his hand, then finally picked it up. "Carter," he said calmly. A woman's anxious voice immediately spilled through the speaker loud enough for Claire to hear fragments. "The Tokyo investors are threatening to walk away. Everyone is waiting." "Where are you?" Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire before looking back down at the table. "Tell them to reschedule." Silence exploded through the speaker. "Reschedule?" the assistant nearly whispered. "Sir, the board has been trying to reach you for almost an hour." Ethan's expression remained calm. "Then tonight is probably very educational for them." Claire blinked in surprise. Ethan ended the call before another word could be said and quietly placed the phone back down. "You skipped a multi-million-dollar meeting," Claire said carefully. Ethan looked strangely peaceful for the first time all night. "Apparently." "Why?" He stared at her for several long seconds before answering. "Honest again. Because for the first time in years, I sat down somewhere and forgot to perform." Claire felt something shift quietly inside her chest at those words. Dangerous. Unexpected. Human. Outside, the city lights reflected softly across the diner windows, while midnight faded slowly toward morning. Ethan looked toward the old piano standing near the front entrance of the diner. Worn wood. Missing varnish along the edges. Forgotten by almost everyone walking past it. "Do you still play?" he asked softly. Claire followed his gaze immediately. "Not in front of people." Ethan stood slowly from the booth, leaving several crisp $100 bills beneath the coffee cups without looking at them. Then he extended one hand toward her with the quietest smile she had seen all night. "Good," he said gently. "Then nobody else has to be here." Claire stared at Ethan's outstretched hand while the old diner lights reflected softly across the polished surface of the forgotten piano near the entrance. The instrument looked tired. Scratches along the wood. One chipped ivory key near the center. A coffee stain faded into the corner like somebody had stopped caring years ago. Somehow that made it feel more honest. Absolutely not, Claire whispered immediately. Ethan kept his hand extended anyway. You said nobody else has to be here. That does not mean I suddenly become brave. I am beginning to think you already are. Claire looked up at him then. Really looked. Billionaires usually carried confidence like armor. Ethan did not tonight. He looked uncertain, hopeful somehow. That frightened her more than arrogance would have. Across the diner, the college student still slept over open textbooks while the old man, near the window, quietly stirred his coffee without paying attention to anything around him. The world remained ordinary. Yet Claire's pulse suddenly was not. One song, Ethan said gently. Then I disappear back into my absurdly expensive life. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. You make your life sound like a museum. Ethan considered that for a second. Most museums are quieter. Against her better judgment, Claire slowly stood from the booth. Ethan stepped aside as she walked toward the piano near the front entrance. Her fingers brushed lightly against the worn wood as if greeting an old friend she had not seen in years. Then she stopped moving completely. Ethan stayed several feet away without speaking. He noticed the subtle change in her breathing. The hesitation. Fear, maybe. Not a failure. Of remembering. Claire lowered herself carefully onto the piano bench. The old springs creaked softly beneath her weight. Her hands hovered above the keys, but did not touch them yet. My father used to say pianos remember when people stop playing them, she said quietly. Ethan leaned lightly against the nearby counter, watching her. Was he right? Claire pressed one single note. Soft. Fragile. The sound drifted through the diner like something waking up slowly after years asleep. Unfortunately, then her fingers finally moved. Ethan forgot to breathe for a moment. The melody was soft at first. Careful. Like someone opening a door they were not sure they still had permission to enter. But then something changed. Claire closed her eyes slightly, and the music deepened. Warm. Emotional. Achingly beautiful in the quietest way possible. Rainwater still slid gently down the diner windows while the old piano filled the empty room with something no amount of money could manufacture. Memory. Grief. Hope. Ethan stood completely still watching her. The waitress disappeared. So did the tiredness around her eyes. Sitting at the piano, Claire looked like someone returning home after being lost for years. Even the old waitress behind the counter stopped drying glasses halfway through. The college student slowly lifted his head from the textbooks. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Claire kept playing. Ethan felt something painful tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Not because the music was perfect, because it was honest. He suddenly understood what she meant earlier about life becoming loud. The world had buried this part of her beneath bills and subway delays and double shifts until even she almost forgot it existed. Yet here it was, still alive. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly toward the floor. His mother used to play exactly like this. Not technically perfect. Emotional. Human. He had not heard piano played without performance attached to it since he was 16 years old. Claire finally finished the last note softly enough that it almost disappeared into the rain outside. Silence followed. Real silence. The kind people are usually too uncomfortable to allow. Claire opened her eyes slowly and looked down at her hands resting on the keys. See? She whispered without looking up. Rusty. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Claire. She finally looked toward him. That was not rusty. The emotion in his voice surprised both of them. Claire looked away quickly toward the piano keys again. Ethan stepped closer carefully, like speaking too loudly might break something fragile in the room. Why did you stop? He asked quietly. Claire swallowed once before answering. Because life got practical. That is the saddest sentence I have heard in years. She laughed faintly under her breath, though her eyes glistened slightly beneath the diner lights. You should spend less time around billionaires then. Ethan did not smile this time. He was still staring at her with the same expression people reserve for things they were never supposed to witness. Claire suddenly became aware of how close he stood now. Not touching her. Not crowding her. Just there. Quiet. Present. Human. Outside. The rain finally stopped completely. Manhattan glowed softly beyond the diner windows, while somewhere far above the city, a private jet continued waiting for a man who no longer seemed in a hurry to leave. The diner remained quiet long after the final piano note disappeared. Claire slowly lifted her hands from the worn keys while Ethan stood nearby without speaking, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not fully understand. Not admiration exactly. Something deeper. Something almost painful. The old waitress behind the counter finally smiled softly before returning to her coffee pots like she understood better than either of them what had just happened. Claire exhaled slowly and stood from the piano bench. "Well," she said quietly, brushing one hand against her coat sleeve, "that was terrifying." Ethan shook his head once, still staring at her. No, his voice remained low. "Honest. That was the first real thing I have seen in a very long time." Claire looked away immediately, suddenly uncomfortable beneath the weight of sincerity in his tone. "You are exaggerating because you skipped your billionaire meetings." "Claire." She glanced back toward him. Ethan stepped closer slowly, careful not to crowd her. "Do you know what happens in my world every day?" She folded her arms lightly against the cold still lingering near the diner windows. "People argue about money in expensive rooms." A faint smile touched his face for barely a second. "People perform. Constantly." His eyes drifted briefly toward the city outside. "Everyone wants to appear powerful, intelligent, necessary." He looked back at her again. "Tonight was the first conversation I have had in years that did not feel rehearsed." Claire stayed quiet. Ethan glanced toward the old piano behind her. "And then you sat down and played like somebody remembering who they are." The sentence landed softly between them. Claire swallowed once before answering. "You make things sound prettier than they are." "No," Ethan said gently. "I think you spent years making beautiful things sound small so nobody notices how much losing them hurt." Claire looked down immediately after that. The diner lights reflected faintly against the silver piano charm resting near her collarbone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, dawn slowly began softening the edges of the Manhattan skyline. The rain was gone now. Just wet streets and quiet traffic beneath pale, early morning light. Ethan finally checked his watch again. This time he laughed softly at himself afterward. "There it is," Claire murmured. "Habit." He nodded once. "Unfortunately." Claire glanced toward the diner clock near the kitchen. "Almost 4 in the morning. Your pilot probably hates me by now." Ethan slid one hand into his coat pocket. "My pilot is very well compensated for emotional inconvenience." Claire laughed quietly under her breath. Then the silence returned again. Not awkward, just difficult. Because they both understood something had shifted tonight neither of them expected. Ethan finally reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a simple white business card. No gold lettering. No dramatic branding. Just his name and a private number written neatly beneath it. He placed it gently on top of the piano keys beside her. "This is not a billionaire gesture," he said carefully. "It is just a phone number." Claire looked at the card but did not touch it yet. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "Call me if you ever decide life should get less practical again." Her eyes slowly lifted toward his. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said quietly. "The world got quieter when you played tonight. I think that deserves another chance." Claire stared at him for several seconds without answering. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street while the city slowly woke around them. Ethan stepped back then. No pressure. No performance. Just one final look before turning toward the diner entrance. Claire watched him walk away beneath the soft morning light spilling through the windows. The billionaire with helicopters and private jets suddenly looked strangely simple, carrying only his coat over one shoulder. Halfway to the door, Ethan paused and glanced back toward her one last time. "You know," he said quietly, "my mother used to tell me something about piano players." Claire tilted her head slightly. "What?" A faint smile touched his face. "The quiet ones usually feel everything the loudest." Then he disappeared out into the early Manhattan morning. Claire stood motionless beside the old piano long after the diner door closed behind him. Her eyes lowered slowly toward the business card resting on the worn piano keys. Outside, black SUVs pulled silently away from the curb, while somewhere far above the city, a private jet finally prepared for takeoff. But Claire barely noticed any of it now. Her fingers moved carefully across the edge of the card before lifting it gently into her hand. The old waitress behind the counter watched her with a knowing smile. "Nice man?" she asked softly. Claire looked toward the window where Ethan had vanished into the waking city. Then down at the piano beside her. A tiny smile finally appeared at the corner of her lips. "No," she whispered quietly. "Just a very lonely one." And for the first time in years, Claire Whitmore no longer looked like someone who had given up on